we should call maintenance.
I'll fix it. I'm gonna fix it.
Concentrate it, maintain it, maintain control.
Maintenance complete.
This is The Maintainers, a Blue Cap community podcast. My name is David Lee, director of Tractian, and your host for The Maintainers Show.
And I'm Jake Hall, the manufacturing millennial. On today's episode, we're joined by John Davis, vice president at American Wood Fibers. John has an incredible story to tell going back decades. When he was 10 years old, he was working on engines as a kid. He worked on the early years of automation at Sun Microsystems, where he managed an entire campus consisting of more than 40 buildings. And we're going to learn more about his journey to where he is today as the VP of AWF in this conversation. But first, a word from our sponsors.
This podcast is brought to you by Tractian. Tractian offers streamlined hardware and software solutions designed to make maintenance more reliable and profitable. Their AI-powered condition monitoring and asset management solution predicts machine failures and unplanned downtime, allowing clients to save an average of $10 million every trimester. It's artificial intelligence quarterbacking your maintenance.
Well, thanks for joining us today, John. How are you doing today?
Great. I appreciate the invite.
So to kick things off, what's some of the favorite winter activities that you like to do to, intro yourself to this audience?
Sure. I'm not sure they're my favorite, but they're the necessities of moving snow from where I don't want it to another place. So there's plenty of that going on already.
Awesome. John, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started into the industry, because obviously we know you have a lot of experience. You've had a lot of cool projects. So get us a little bit more acquainted with you.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I did cut my teeth at Sun Microsystems. I was pretty young when I started working there. I had an opportunity to, do the sort of things that you would in sort of in the maintenance area, general maintenance. But then I quickly got into HVAC electrical as into automation. At one point, I was tasked with automating the entire campus. And Sun, back in the late 80s was growing at about 50% a quarter. So extreme growth, buying buildings, leasing buildings, which means just bringing on massive amounts of equipment. So, the group that I was in was tasked with, certainly taking that equipment on and ensuring, its uptime was at a very high level. So the Microsystem campus in Mountain View where I worked was a 24/7 campus. So engineering focus, which means a lot of data rooms, data centers, clean rooms, that sort of thing. So uptime and equipment was paramount. So it was sort of trial by fire and sort of jumping in the deep end with regards to learning, everything from a retail refrigerator to a massive chiller system on a multi-story building and everything in between.
So, John, where did you start your career? I mean, you worked on engines, you said when you were 10 years old, but what inspired you to really get into this industry?
I think just having the mechanical aptitude from a kid. I had an uncle who was part of a motorcycle club in California, and I sort of watched him work on motorcycles and cars and just every kind of piece of equipment you could imagine. So literally from the age of 5 or 6, understanding that mechanical equipment and having the aptitude to understand how things work. But also I was very interested in electronics and software. In high school, I was working on a lot of software projects and electronics, building stereos, doing things like that. So understanding how electronics and mechanical systems can work together, obviously eventually got me into the area of automation and the software side of it as well.
And so when you graduated high school, what was your next step in education? Did you go do an apprenticeship? Did you just go right into the workforce? What did that look like?
So I did things a little differently. So I graduated a few months before the end of my sophomore year in high school. And at the age of 15, then I started college at the age of 15, just at a local JC initially. And then I eventually went on to work at a few different colleges, Sacramento University, and then some private colleges that dealt more in the electronics and robotics era. That was in sort of the mid to late 80s. So the robotics sector was really coming on strong, especially on the manufacturing side with regards to automotive sector. So once I sort of jumped deep in with regards to schooling, I had an opportunity at Sun Microsystems when I was 17, actually. And so I moved all my classes to evening classes. And again, I jumped into Sun. And initially, it was just sort of, whatever needed to be done. As a matter of fact, my first project, the folks had just moved out of building one. All the executives, Sun was really starting to gain momentum. They asked me to replace every single ceiling tile in a 65,000 square foot building. So that was my welcome, if you will, at the age of 17, being sort of the new kid on the block, quite literally. So, and from there, Sun gave us an opportunity for education, whether it was HVAC or, like I said, the electrical side or even electronics, whatever it was. And then I eventually learned how to use Unix and started porting over some of the automation systems that back then were DOS based and
Yep.
porting those over to Unix system. So they would run on the Sun network, which was a government-based network. They were the only company at that time that was allowed to work on some of the government projects. So the things that we were doing, we could port them over to literally a secure network and bring them anywhere.
When you step back and you think about that, what was like the one big thing that just got you excited about that with your job?
I'd say, the bigger stuff, the larger chiller equipment, larger boilers. When you're taking a massive piece of equipment that controls a very large area and manipulating it with literally just, keystrokes on a keyboard, or even to the point where you could port it over to your phone in the very early days of using phone technology before, the iPhones and everything came out. That's pretty cool. Knowing that you can have that kind of effect from anywhere in the world on equipment. And also be able to monitor it. Back then, being on call and having a two-way pager and eventually a big old brick phone that you carried around, Sun was able to get into a lot of technology before the general public because of the government contracts. So we had a lot of technology available to us that wasn't available to the general population. So we use that technology to monitor the uptime of the site to ensure that, things ran 24/7. And with all of us being on call, especially myself, it wasn't unusual to put in, 60, 80 hours a week just to make sure these sites are running. So the better tech you had to monitor equipment, even back then, was paramount.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah. So now that we know a little bit more about you, John, it's time for our first segment, the Maintainer Mashup. This is where we'll talk about the equipment, management, and teams, and find out how we can make maintenance more reliable.
Maintenance required.
Listen, I maintain.
I maintain them myself.
Maintain course.
Maintain speed.
I gotta maintain respect.
So can we hear a little bit more about American Wood Fiber specifically? And for those who don't know in the audience, American Wood Fiber is the nation's leader when it comes to producing wood shavings and wood flour, so we can create fillers and extenders for multiple industries across the board. So tell us a little bit about American Wood Fiber.
Yeah, sure. So I've been there about 8 years now, and I manage the Western U.S. The company really relies on sort of the secondary market with regards to wood byproducts. So we utilize a lot of byproducts that come off of large lumber mills, and we purpose some of the shavings and sort of wood dust, if you will, that comes off it, and we repurpose that into bedding or wood pellets for barbecuing and or heat. Bedding for multiple animals, from horses all the way down to sort of small caged animals and things like that. So it's really trying to repurpose byproduct that's available on the market. And specifically in California, especially at our Jamestown location, we repurpose a lot of the forest fire material that's out there. Obviously, there's been a lot of fires in California in the past, half dozen years. And a lot of that material does make its way down to the lumber mills. However, it definitely gets compromised after 6 months or a year or so, and it's no longer good for lumber. So we take that in and shave it down and repurpose it for various different products. And so, it really helps with sort of the environmental impact, especially in California, and trying to sort of get the reforestation going.
So the one thing that I'm thinking about, John, this is just from my experience, when I'm thinking shavings and I hear, wood flour, I'm thinking of very fine particulate in a lot of areas. When we break down a fine particulate, a lot of times there's, the safety involved with when I'm thinking of, explosion proof, intrinsically safe stuff. Can you talk more about just the experience that you have when it comes to focusing, the time and energy into ADWF when it's growing? How do you ensure, I guess you could say, that all the processes are still running, with when it comes to like that preventative maintenance and making the machines are, still safe and they're being efficient and they're being productive? What does that look
Yeah, so we have obviously a lot of SOPs baked into the company, standard operating procedures. You're right. There's a lot of volatility in what we do, especially on the wood flower sites, where you have large silos and explosion issues are definitely fire is a concern at every one of our locations. So it's paramount that safety is first in all of our locations. And of course, part of the safety program is the work order program, the PM program, and ensuring that there's documentation and sort of structure around that. We really push the SOP at all of our plants. They do vary quite a bit, but I guess the most important thing is that they don't get stagnant or stale. So as we find new technologies or we find better ways of doing things, or there's better equipment or better monitoring, we take advantage of that and we try to carry that over to all of our facilities. So as a company, we meet at least once a week with all of the senior management and discuss, progress, issues, updates, better ways of doing things. So we try to stay at least on sort of the cutting edge of what's available out there, how to do things. And then if we do find an issue with a piece of equipment or the way something was installed, we do send out memos company-wide to say, this was addressed at this particular location, and if your location has something similar, we may need to modify the SOP or at least modify the safety standards. So we really do and try very hard to keep on top of all of these things by communication, and obviously trying to use technology.
Right. So you touched on communication, things like with these work orders and SOPs being shared and having this effectively seamless so everyone can utilize it in your company. So to get there, typically speaking, there's going to be a slew of projects that need to take place to maybe it's upgrading a facility in some way or procedures, admin controls, or whatever that looks like. So can you tell us a little bit about maybe some previous projects that you've done and then maybe some future projects that have been impactful? Because we'd love to hear about that from you specifically, as you have a lot under your belt.
Yeah, sure. As a company, again, we're looking for new technology. So if there's a safer way of doing things, we kiln dry a lot of our products, which, can be inherently dangerous. So we're always looking, we've installed new drying systems, new technology that's come out, and we're looking abroad. We look throughout, Asia and Europe for technologies that are available, or maybe something different. And we've utilized those in projects in the past. Again, the drying side of things, we've looked at lower temperature drying so that you're not dealing with high temperatures so it creates sort of a less of a safety issue. We're looking at expansion of our plants, whether it's expanding the footprint of what we shave or even products that we bring in. Historically, we're really focused on the wood byproducts, but in recent years, we've got into the paper byproducts as well. So utilizing, paper that's out there, like for instance, filters on a coffee cup or coffee K-cup. There's a lot of byproduct that comes out of punching those out. So we're looking at repurposing that into bedding as well. We've done that at some of our plant expansion. But the paramount side of this is the safety side. So no matter what product lines we take on or expansion on existing product lines, it's doing it at a very high level with regards to safety. So if that's putting in fire protection, or if that's putting in monitoring, or if that's putting in additional safety people to sort of address these different locations, then that's part of it as well.
I think it's great how you're addressing a really big sustainable problem. When it comes to is manufacturing have an impact on sustainability? And here's a great example of how much recycled product that you're using to then, I guess you could say create more value out of it. I think that's just what makes manufacturing so incredible. So what I want to do is move into the second segment, which is more focused on what is in your individual toolkit.
We're gonna fix it. Get the tool.
Pick the one right tool.
The right tool for the right job.
We're talking about how you guys are growing. We're talking about how you're creating, and improving SOP and how you're improving safety. But really what I want to focus now is how are you doing your best to manage change on the floor? I think change is always a big thing, if it's either through growth or it's through leadership. Can you talk about what you've seen in your career on how success is created through change, and maybe in areas where change has fallen short in expectations?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, change can certainly be difficult, especially if it's large change. So, managing it effectively is a big deal. I'll give you an example. I did a project years ago for IBM, and it was a massive change to their operation. It was at the time their primary location, their corporate headquarters in the Bay Area. And we were doing a large project in automating their chiller plant. And it was actually one of the first neural networks I ever worked on. This is in the late 90s. And it was quite a large chiller plant, 24,000 tons. And it had been operated the same way for 25, 30 years. And the tenure of the average mechanic was probably around that same time frame. So coming in and completely automating or completely changing how something operates to make it more efficient, especially on a scale of that size, can be daunting by the folks that have been there for quite some time and doing it the same way for years and years. The attitude could be that, look, it's worked this way for a lot of years and we've done a good job, so why change it? So when you're going in, but we were looking at saving them 20, 25% in their utility costs by making it a more efficient operation. So eventually we went in and did some very high level automation and put in some neural network controls so we'd learn over time based on weather patterns and some other things. But the most important thing is before the project even started, we did a high level of training with the folks there to really get them on board before, the first wrench turn, before the first drill came out, before we did anything. We got everybody on board as to what this would look like when it was all said and done, and the fact that they were going to be comfortable utilizing the technology when it was all said and done. And that went a long ways because if you don't get an early adoption for the folks that are going to be left with whatever you do, it could be all for naught, or you're going to have some extreme pushback. So again, the communications, the training, sort of trying to convey new technology to people can be difficult. But if you take the time early on and sort of, talk in their language, it will go a long way versus just dictating something and installing it and saying, here, here's what you're left with. So that's an example of, a very large project and an extreme change to an operation. When you're talking about a campus of that size, it literally has its own street lights and, it's just massive. So it can be scary for folks.
For sure. Now, when it comes to these type projects, as you mentioned, change is it's always going to be a challenge, right? You have so much experience, you're able to overcome this. Now, have you had any experience where there was a clear need, but you ran into whether it be approval walls or any sort of challenges like that you weren't able to overcome or you didn't expect to overcome, and then maybe later you learned some new lessons on how to do that? More challenging type situations.
Yeah, sure. So I think generally speaking, there's been pushback on new technology, especially because of initial cost. If you look at most technology change and equipment change, there's a huge upfront cost. And that could be a tough pill to swallow, whether it's at the CFO level or any other level within the company. When I had my own automation company, ROIs are a big deal, right? So you have to be able to explain what the return on an investment will be, both financially and technically. So if you're trying to sell to a CFO, but also trying to sell to the maintenance manager that they're not going to be stuck with the system that they can't use at the end of the day, those are two very different conversations that you have to have. And,
Right.
maybe you get buy off at the CFO level that the ROI makes sense. It's, 1.5 year payback. That looks great. But on the technical side, maybe the maintenance manager or the operations manager has some trepidation about the technology and whether or not they're comfortable in using that technology to run that site. And I've gotten pushback from both those areas, right? So sometimes one gives you sign off, the other doesn't. And, sometimes it's cost, sometimes it's technical. So I think being able to speak both those languages to both those different groups of people is paramount so that you get understanding and buy up. Now, it doesn't always work out that way, but sometimes you come back a year or two later, maybe the technology's changed, or maybe the costs have come down on that technology. And then maybe it's more palatable at that point in time. But I think you have to have the patience and understanding to know your audience, and whether it's a customer of mine or I am the customer to an internal company, I think the communication is similar. Sometimes companies can be scared to spend money on projects where you don't know if the outcome is going to be beneficial or not.
Absolutely. Well, I would say let's jump into our third segment, the future of factories, where we'll cover the new trends that we're seeing across the industry or what we want to see look like ahead.
Meet the future!
To our futures.
What future?
The factory. My factory. Everybody's factory.
I love your factory.
My factory, my rules.
John, you've seen a lot of different industries that you've been a part of with your experience. And I think one of the biggest things that you can share is just the generational change that you've seen in our industries. Can you talk more about your experience as what I call, being a veteran in this industry, what we need to do to get the next generations on board in this industry as well and get them excited about what we're doing?
Sure. So it's clear that the last two generations have been sort of more computer minded than the previous. And, I think a lot of things that I've done in my career were maybe a generation or even two ahead of their time, especially with some of the automation in the 80s and moving into the 90s. We were trying to put things on the web in the early 90s, mid 90s. The things that are sort of taken for granted today. You can do just about anything from your phone, right? You can sit on your couch with your phone and turn on the lights. You can monitor things halfway across the world and all the way across the world. So I think you have to understand what today's technology is with this current generation, especially as we're hiring folks in today's market. Some of our mills, we have very tough jobs, right? So they're not the easiest jobs, they're not the most glamorous. But if there's a technology spin on that job, for instance, we have packaging lines where we bale our product or we palletize our product. In the past, 4 or 5 years or even more, we've automated quite a bit of that. We put in robotics, put in automated pallet stacking, we put in, automated baling systems. And there are, for the most part, all PLC based with interfaces to the web. And most of them do have some sort of app that you can look at. So knowing that you might be doing a tough position, but part of it is sort of a very high tech piece as well, goes a long way, especially when you're interviewing new candidates of a younger generation. The fact that we can, we've got tablets, we've got our maintenance people, they have their maintenance cards. They've all got tablets. So with those tablets, they can maintain and monitor equipment, especially with some of the new technologies with Traction. But they can have a view into their world that they may have not had, that many years ago. So I think that's imperative in this generation that you have that technology, you have sort of that correspondence to what they're doing on a day-to-day basis on their phone, whether it's social media or whatever. The fact that we're using some of the latest technology in maybe an older type of, vertical market, I think shows that we're trying to keep up with the times, and that goes a long way. Especially, it's so hard to hire people nowadays. So you have to have something. Again, they're maybe not the most glamorous jobs, but if there's a technical spin to it, I think that goes a long way.
Would you say that when you put in that automated equipment, those end-of-line robots, or even just, having, it sounds like you might have some basics level of a SCADA system or, digital display of what, your OEE is running on those machines. Would you say that that's attracting or that's bringing new generations into those jobs easier?
Sure, it's twofold. We do have a lot of digital feedback. So we've got display boards that are showing, widgets per hour. We have display boards that are showing uptime. We have a lot of this that's in your face. It's both appealing to the person that's working on it because you get real-time feedback, but it's also accountability. It's an immediate accountability as well, right? So anybody can see how they're doing or how they're not doing or how our peer is doing. And then we can also run, statistics between shifts. We run 3 shifts at most of our plants, or a lot of them. So you have sort of this soft competition between shifts about performance and uptime and, widgets produced. So it really does create sort of an environment where people are engaged with what's happening. It's not like you're just going in and putting your 8 hours. You have no idea how the plant's doing or how you did during. Everybody has pretty much real-time feedback as to what was accomplished, what was accomplished during the week, the month, the year, how we're trending. So putting those tools into place, I think is good because the more communication, people feel more engaged in their job and their role.
Right. And you touched on something a moment ago. You mentioned Traction and a few of the different facets that you just talked about, really having that visibility and things, and that shareability and that situational awareness. Out of all these different, I would say, goals, what is your specific reason for utilizing Traction, for example? And what are your hopes when it comes to the enterprise goals for the next year or two doing that?
I think to, eliminate silly mistakes and or find the low hanging fruit. People get very busy in their day-to-day life and especially on the maintenance side, you can get mired in it and just sort of doing a stack of PMs or dealing with work orders. So it's important to do them in a fashion that's smart. And that was kind of the appeal of Traction, is that we can look at what our low hanging fruit is on any given minute, any given day. When they come in the morning, they can see in real time how the systems are running or not running, as the case may be. And that sort of sets your priority for the day, right? I mean, if you are going to be, changing the oil in something that's not very high priority, but yet now you see you got a bearing maybe vibrating or a motor that's getting hot or something that you would never notice on your own. And now all of a sudden you're directed and focused into an area that's far more important than, maybe a routine oil change on a piece of equipment. So I think directing folks in a smart way to the areas of interest that make most sense throughout the day is paramount. Especially, like I said, most of our sites are running multiple shifts a day, and 5 or 6 days a week. So with that amount of runtime, sometimes you don't always have the appropriate amount of time to get every PM done or every work order done, but you certainly need to get the ones that make the most impact done and that keep those sites running. When you're looking at a manufacturing site where, everything's counted on, widgets per minute, per hour, per week, downtime is very meaningful. And also part of the traction system allows us to track that downtime, to track the cost of that downtime. And if we're being smarter about where we're focusing our efforts, not everybody has every single mechanic they want or maintenance person. So you're dealing with sort of the level of folks that you have. You want to make sure that they're most engaged to the areas that they should be and sort of not dealing with something that's routine when you have something that's priority at that time, I guess is the best way. And all of those areas were checked off by Traction and certainly, and then maybe moving into the CMMS side of it as well, being able to integrate those two things. So that you have real-time work order generation, you have real-time sort of PM generation based on actual run hours and things like that versus just sort of a guesstimate. So that's all very, very valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's amazing to really think about that point, right? Where this is actually helping the plant, obviously, but it's also helping the lives of the individuals who are working in the plant and doing this maintenance work. And so we're looking at higher levels of retention, but also with the newer generation being being the types that really were born with technology, then they're going to be more interested in doing these type jobs and things as they become more high tech oriented. So one question for you, as we touched on this, but also the next generation, would you have any advice? Let's say you were talking to yourself back when you were 15 years old. You wanted to be a guy that was involved in hands-on type work, but also you learn that you're good with automation and things like that. What would you tell yourself about the future of factories and where you would what you would take as actions to get to your future? Any sort of advice like that?
Sure. Well, I guess I'm probably aging myself, but back then, we didn't have Google, you didn't have the internet, quite frankly. So when you were doing your research, it was literally service manuals or just trying to go to the library and pull out what you could. That nowadays everything's at your fingertips. So it's a lot easier not to make the same mistakes as people have done in the past, right? So you can go out and do a lot of research. I've talked about different books, but one of the books I've read is Car Guys versus Bean Counters. Bob Lutz, who ran GM for a while, and he was at Chrysler and some other, he was brought out of inventory and he wrote this book to help GM out in the early 2000s. GM in the late 80s, early 90s was trying to compete with a lot of the Japanese manufacturing processes, which were highly automated. And they dove in head first in the 90s, especially with the Saturn division. And it was an epic failure. They were going to just automate the whole process of the car and stamping out plastic parts. And they were just going to make these things so fast that profits were going to shoot through the roof. The opposite ended up happening. The quality went down, and sort of the attention to detail went down. And, automation is great as long as you can manage what you automate, how you automate it. And if you go overboard, and quite frankly, if you don't have the people who know how to operate the automation post installation, then you could really shoot yourself in the foot. And that's happened with a lot of manufacturing. I just read Elon's book here recently, and he's got a lot of just genius ideas, but trying to make those ideas replicate themselves in the form of manufacturing, whether it's a car or a spaceship or whatever it might be, or just, a shavings bale. It's sort of all the same processes to, how do we get from point A to point B, do it reliably, do it safely, and do it consistently. Those are trivial things, right? A lot of people come up with a lot of great ideas about a product, but trying to manufacture a product in those manners is difficult. And to do it consistently is difficult because when you're manufacturing the same thing potentially over and over and over, you can get sort of agnostic to the process. You can sort of get callous to it. So, using better technology to understand what you're doing, how you're doing, is it still the most efficient as you were doing it 5 years ago? Should it be more efficient? Just sort of constantly bettering yourself. And again, there's a lot of information, especially with AI out there today, and like Traction is certainly using that technology. There's a lot more, I guess, tools that you can put in your tool bag nowadays that you need to capture and you need to utilize.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, those are very wise words, and totally appreciate that. So before we say goodbye to John, it's time for our final segment, the Fix It Funnies.
The fix is in.
It's making a really funny noise.
I'm gonna fix it.
Make it funny would be great if you could make it funny.
Your fate is fixed.
That's what makes it funny. Make sure it's funny.
All right, so John, with the new year upon us, what are your biggest plans for next year and things that you're looking forward to?
Well, I'm sure by next spring I'll be looking forward to the snow melting, so I can dig out. But on the business side, I'm looking forward to some of the new technologies. We just started working with Traction here, and I'm looking forward to the rollout to more of our sites. I'm looking forward to seeing how AI is really going to immerse itself in this vertical in our business line and utilizing that technology. I mean, there's big changes. We've seen a lot of big changes between generations. This is a huge one, right? So trying to better how you produce a product using sort of more intelligence that is beyond the four walls of your facility is a big deal. And educating the folks that you do have on how to utilize those technologies so that you're bringing them up to a higher level as well. That's a big deal. So I do look forward to that. And I think it's going to be more engaging with the employees. And I think employee retention that you mentioned earlier, which is a huge problem within every industry right now. That's going to be a big deal for retention as well as getting them engaged into the daily operation in a more meaningful way.
Absolutely. Awesome.
So, John, if you weren't able to be a part of the manufacturing industry and what you're doing now with your current job, what industry would you want to be in? What other profession would you want to be a part of?
Good question. I'd say, given the current landscape, sort of anything in the AI space and understanding that. So I did my first neural network more than 20 years ago. I'm really dating myself, but in the late 90s, building the first thing that sort of could learn and getting it to work was a huge, huge project. I mean, it took, multiple years and a lot of cost back then. It paid out, but being in that space, I'd say today in this world is exciting. Beyond that, I'd probably be building cars or motorcycles or something like that. It maybe doesn't pay the bills in the same manner, but those are definitely a couple of the areas that are of interest.
Nice. Are you looking at any sort of specific content right now, whether it be podcasts? You did mention books, but maybe Netflix specials, anything that kind of appeals to, I would say, our maintenance and engineering personality type?
Podcasts are a big one. I listen to quite a few. And I recently listened to Sam Altman and Elon and guys like that. And Sam obviously on the AI side, but Elon more on the manufacturing side. I mean, as brilliant as the guy as he is, you come up with all these grandiose ideas and being able to actually make something more than once and do it over and over in a quality way is a big deal. And that really lends itself obviously to what we do, not maybe on the same level, but it's just the idea of that context, is meaningful. And so for that reason, so I follow some of those folks who are sort of doing the latest and greatest right now. And there's been a lot of buzz on a lot of podcasts recently with those folks. And so I tend to watch that quite a bit.
Awesome. Yeah, same here. Definitely following all the same content that you are.
Yeah.
So great.
All right. With all the years and decades of experience under your belt, if you were to go back and work on one machine again, what would that be?
Yeah, that's hard. That's hard to pin down because I'm sure there's been tens of thousands of pieces of the machinery. Besides the obvious, which are machines that get you from point A to point B very fast, which my own cars and motorcycles. Those are my favorite by far. But I would probably go back to the IBM project. I don't think I've ever worked on machines of that size ever. Or probably never will again. That project was probably the most impactful project that I've ever worked on, just from a scale perspective. And you don't get an opportunity to work on things that large very often. I mean, give you an example, when you change the setting on one of the chillers, it took 45 minutes to see the reaction. That's how big the chiller lid was. I mean, it was just a massive 36-inch pipe that basically went through an entire city before the war. So, being able to have predictive analysis and tell that machine how to operate most effectively based on something that hasn't happened yet, like a building loading up or the temperature changing outside, but knowing what might happen and sort of being smart about telling it what it should do is kind of a big deal and sort of very, very early AI. So I'd say in my career, that was something that was at least 20 years ahead of its time. So it's kind of nice to see it happening in real time today.
That's right. We finally got to that crystal ball effect with AI.
A little bit, yeah.
Awesome. So, John, thanks again for coming to our show. It has been absolutely wonderful to have you. And for everyone else, this has been The Maintainers, a Blue Cap community podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your different podcasts, as we're on most major platforms. This concludes our season 1. Thank you all for joining us throughout 2023. Stay tuned for season 2 coming in 2024. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
This podcast is brought to you by Tractian. Tractian offers streamlined hardware and software solutions designed to make maintenance more reliable and profitable. Their AI-powered condition monitoring and asset management solution predicts machine failures and unplanned downtime, allowing clients to save an average of $10 million every trimester. It's artificial intelligence quarterbacking your maintenance.